Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of The Interview. Well, for the second time in under a year, the British have gone to the polls, and for a second time the results have been somewhat surprising. British Prime Minister Theresa May, who called for these snap general elections, has actually finished by losing her majority in Parliament and is now looking to establish a partnership with the Democratic Unionist Party, the largest unionist party in Northern Ireland, and work with them as she starts these crucial Brexit negotiations with the 27 across in the EU. Now, the DUP did want a Brexit, but not quite the same one that Conservative May was pushing for, not quite that hard Brexit. So will the general election results have an impact on the UK's future relationship with the EU and its international partners in general? To tell us more, we're joined live from London by Mr. Jonathan Powell. Mr. Powell, you're a former Chief of Staff for Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair. You also worked with Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron as a special envoy to Libya. Today, you're the Director of Intermediate, a charity that works on conflict resolution, and you're also a co-chair of something called the Brexit Exchange, bringing businesses together to look at how they're going to work on that international field. Thanks so much for your time. And can you start by giving us your reaction to these results in those British elections? Theresa May lost, but no one really won. Any idea why?
Yes, I think in the end what we've had here is a vote for none of the above. No party really attracted them. The Tories ran a very poor campaign. Theresa May was found out during the campaign. They tried to major with her as the main leader, but she turned out not to be a very attractive leader. And so voters really had a sort of, as if in France, where you vote for cohabitation sometimes when you have the president of one party and the parliament of another. It's the same sort of thing here. People have voted for neither to be in power, so we've ended up with a hung parliament.
So a bit of a disaster, if you like, for the UK at a very crucial time in your history when you're starting those negotiations with, for now at least, a united 27 in the cross in the EU.
Well, it may not be quite the disaster that you say. It's certainly a big surprise, but sometimes electorates are quite wise, because I think this does change the geography in terms of the negotiations on Brexit. Had Theresa May won a big majority, very little would have changed in terms of the Brexit negotiations, but I think this changes things. Behind me, you see the House of Commons, and the geography inside the House of Commons has now changed. There is no longer a majority in that building for a hard Brexit, for a Brexit where we jump off the cliff. So the threats you've heard from David Davis and people like that, that if we don't get the deal we want, we're going to walk away and we're going to go off a cliff and go in WTO measures, that is no longer supported in that building. There are Tory MPs against it, the Labour Party is against it, and the other parties are against it. So I think things have changed really quite dramatically. And secondly, you have a Prime Minister who is badly wounded, who has suffered. She called an election, she thought she'd get a massive majority, and she didn't. She's very weak. She thinks she can stagger on with the support of the DUP, but that's actually a sign of her desperation. Even John Major, at his weakest in the beef war, didn't depend on the DUP. So this is really quite a turn-up for the books. Do you see that government then as being stable going forward, or could we see new elections on the horizon in the quite short to medium term? Well, of course, Theresa May ran on a ticket of being strong and stable. I notice she's now dropped the words in the course of today, perhaps not surprisingly, but she's saying now that she's going to provide certainty. But I think the last thing she's providing is certainty. You've already heard this morning mumbles inside the Tory party about replacing her. She was never, of course, elected by the Tory party. There was never a contested election. Every other candidate fell by the wayside. So I think there'll be quite a lot of murmuring about her going forward. They wanted to stay there for now. They want to move on because they've done so badly in the election. But she is not going to be able to remain very long in that position. I doubt she's going to last a full parliament.
Which really, you know, the clock is ticking at the other side. Those negotiations are due to end with the EU in 2019. But you mentioned also the DUP party, that Northern Irish party. Again, they don't want that leaving the single market, cutting all economic ties with the EU. What else do you think they might look for from Theresa May when it comes to, you know, in counterpart for their support for her government?
Well, I really think this is quite a big problem, the Tories depending on the DUP. In their formal agreement, the DUP will ask for economic things and issues like that. But in reality, what they're getting is a stranglehold on the government. The government knows it will lose a vote in the House of Commons the second the DUP desert them. And what they're going to be asking for is constitutional changes. And this is a problem because in Northern Ireland, as you know, we don't have an executive at the moment. There's a political crisis between the Catholics and the Protestants. We can't establish a government there. Now, the people doing the mediating have been the British government. Now the British government is on one side, and the whole basis of our peace process was that we were neutral. From 91 onwards, the British government has been neutral between the Protestant side and the Catholic side, between the Unionists and the Nationalists and Republicans. Now suddenly we find ourselves on one side. So who's going to do the mediating to set up that government? Even worse than that, we have the problem that the EU has listed as one of the 3 priorities for our negotiations on Brexit, which is the border in Ireland between North and South. Now, that is going to be a really difficult issue because, as you say, the DUP were in favour of Brexit, but they were in a minority in Northern Ireland. 57% of the voters in Northern Ireland wanted to remain in the EU. That means Protestants as well as Catholics voted for it because Catholics only account for 40-some% of the population. So the majority in Northern Ireland does not want to leave the EU. So now you have the DUP as part of the government forcing this through. The majority in Northern Ireland is going to be very, very upset about that. So I think it's going to make it extraordinarily difficult to find a settlement in the Brexit negotiations. And
just to remind our viewers, Mr. Powell, of course, you were very much directly involved in those peace negotiations at your time working with Tony Blair. So as you say, you know, not the best scenario for Northern Ireland, looking at the security question, but also a lot of people on both sides seem to say in relation to that border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, everyone says that they want to keep it open. They want to keep it as fluid as possible. But do you think that's possible? It is going to become an external border of the EU.
It will become an external border of the EU, and really it's nonsense. People keep asserting that there will be no hard border. But if you have different customs policy in Northern Ireland, because that's part of the United Kingdom, than from the Republic of Ireland, which is part of the single market, then you're going to have a customs border. You can't have a back door to the EU through Northern Ireland, otherwise everyone will abuse it. Now, they've tried to come up with technical answers like red routes and all sorts of technology. But that border has been the centre of smuggling for centuries. And the notion that somehow they're going to stop that by having 3 roads you can go on. This is a 300-mile border, crisscrossed by small roads. If anyone thinks that people are going to obey the rules on that without them being enforced, that would be a terrible mistake. Secondly, you have the problem that you'll have to set up border posts. Now, people are saying we won't set them up on the border, we'll set them further back. Doesn't make any difference. They're going to be targets for those dissident Republican terrorists that are still out there. They're very small, they're very few, but if you give them a target of those sort of places, people will be shot at, and we'll be back to having an armoured border and having all the small roads blocked again. And we really don't want that. That would undermine the whole basis of the peace process.
Now, Mr. Powell, I also mentioned earlier you're co-chair of this Brexit exchange, which was set up just a few months ago, looking really, I guess, at that economic impact of the Brexit and how businesses will cope. Do you think that the change in tone we might see in terms of that Brexit, moving away perhaps from a hard Brexit, that could be a good thing for the economy?
Absolutely. I do think, as George Osborne actually said last night, I think that hard Brexit is dead. We're not going to see this extremist position that was taken before the election. I think that's very good for business. You think about things like the car industry. How on earth are they going to manage their complicated supply chains if we have to crisscross the border backwards and forwards and we have customs checks? It's not going to work. So I think the reality was always going to kick in at some stage in these negotiations. And I think it's now kicked in earlier. I think we're going to find ourselves gravitating back towards the single market, towards at least an EFTA-style relationship, and even possibly not going ahead with Brexit at all. I mean, one of the things about this election that's so surprising was it was listed as an election about Brexit. Theresa May said she wanted to do it to get a mandate. Actually, she hardly talked about Brexit at all in the campaign, and no one else did. The Labour Party certainly didn't. So it wasn't a Brexit campaign because the British people don't care that much about Europe. Europe is issue number 10 on their list of issues. What they care about are jobs, they care about immigration, they care about hospitals. And that's what they voted on. And so I think we may find ourselves, at least I hope, and this is my personal hope, we'll actually find ourselves drifting back to the much more sensible position of not going ahead with Brexit.
And to do that, to reverse the Brexit, do you think there'd have to be another vote put to the people, a second referendum, or could the government do that on their own?
Well, constitutionally, in our country, as in most countries, actually, this was only a consultative referendum and Parliament could change its mind, or you could have another election. But I think in the circumstances we find ourselves, probably what you need to have is another referendum on whatever deal is done. Or we may discover, as I say, that when we look at the practicalities of this, when we look at things like the Northern Ireland border, when we look at the impact on Scotland wanting to leave the UK, when we look at the impact on the car industry, I think then we may change our minds anyway as a people, in which case, if the opinion polls show clearly the majority are against, then changing our mind would be very easy.
So overall, Mr. Powell, at the outcome of these general elections, are you feeling more or less positive as to the future of your country?
Well, it was a very surprising result. It's not one I predicted at all. But actually, funnily enough, I do feel a bit more encouraged. I think that we may have actually saved our 2 unions. By that, I mean we have certainly saved the United Kingdom because the SNP had a setback in Northern Ireland. So I think the idea of Scotland splitting off has been set back for some time, and that's a good thing in my view. And I think also, as I say, we're certainly not going for a hard Brexit now, and there's at least a prospect we won't have Brexit at all. And I think that would be very good for the UK and actually very good for Europe as well.
OK, and of course, one of your other concerns was Brexit at the time when we're seeing a United States moving more and more that isolationist road. How do you see the future of the UK when it comes to the US and indeed the EU as a whole?
Well, of course, this was one of the problems with Brexit, because British foreign policy since the Second World War has essentially depended on two pillars: our transatlantic relationship with the United States and our relationship inside Europe as a member of the EU. Now, we've kicked away that pillar of the EU by saying we're going to leave and actually get out of the EU, and that's going to be a problem for us, because then we depend just on one pillar, the transatlantic relations. And this has coincided with the election of a rather unusual sort of president in the United States, one who's putting America first, who doesn't seem to attach much store by NATO. And so we've left almost with no pillars to our foreign policy. We're in danger of becoming irrelevant. And I think that's another thing that will be pushing us back towards the EU, at least that's my hope.
OK, Mr. Jonathan Powell, it's been a pleasure speaking to you, and thanks so much for joining us here on France 24, giving us your insights and reactions to those surprising, it has to be said, results from the snap general elections across in the United Kingdom. That brings us to the end of this edition of The Interview. Have a good week. Take care.
Reporters Plus, presented by Mark Owen.
China's single-child policy has unexpectedly caused a scarcity of women. In rural areas, couples have turned to abortion to guarantee their chances of having boys, considered to be better farmhands. This has resulted in a generation of single men who can't find wives. Each day, thousands trade their country homes for the city, hoping to improve the odds of finding a sweetheart. The shortage of Chinese women has prompted other practices, such as kidnappings and mail-order brides. Chinese men are pulling out all the stops to find the rare gem.
Reporters Plus on France 24 and France24.com.